Hello and welcome everyone to my Hazardous Secondary Materials and Recycling presentation. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, tries to encourage generators to recycle their hazardous waste by providing exclusions from the strict hazardous waste regulations. However, they don't make it easy to understand. Unfortunately, recycling exclusions are highly complex and oftentimes it can be difficult to determine if your hazardous waste qualifies for an exclusion. My goal here today is to help you organize your thought process when approaching recycling exclusions to assist you in claiming the exclusion that best fits your waste type and waste recycling activity. So let's start with some definitions. You are going to hear the word recycle a lot throughout this presentation, and that's because it is a catch-all term. Recycle means a material that is reused or reclaimed. So when I'm talking about reuse or reclamation, I can use the general term recycle. However, I cannot use reuse and reclaim interchangeably. A material is used or reused if it is either employed as an ingredient in an industrial process to make a product, or if it is used as an effective substitute for a commercial product, or if the material is returned to the production process without reclamation. A material is reclaimed, however, if it is processed to recover a usable product or if it is regenerated. An example would be the distillation and regeneration of spent solvents. The rules that apply to hazardous waste destined to be recycled can go from no regulation to full regulation, with the amount of regulation depending on the type of material and manner of recycling. A hazardous waste that is destined to be recycled is called a hazardous secondary material, or HSM. Some HSM, even when destined to be recycled, are still classified as a solid waste. Therefore, you still have to follow the hazardous waste regulations up until the actual recycling process takes place. Other HSM, depending on the type of material and manner of recycling, are excluded from the definition of solid waste. Therefore, the HSM is considered a material that does not have to be managed as a hazardous waste prior to the recycling process. That means you may be able to claim a recycling exclusion for your HSM before the process of recycling occurs, as long as you can prove that it is not speculatively accumulated and that the material will be legitimately recycled. When I was researching this topic and creating this presentation, I determined that there are 5 potential categories that your HSM can fall into. Your hazardous waste may be excluded from the definition of solid waste when directly recycled without reclamation. Your hazardous waste may be excluded from the hazardous waste regulations because of where it falls on the recycling table. Or your hazardous waste may not be excluded, meaning the hazardous waste rules apply to storage before reclamation. Or your hazardous waste might be one of the few that, when recycled, has its own management standards. And then there is the all-inclusive hazardous secondary materials exclusions, which allow you to manage the hazardous waste as a material as long as you meet all the qualifications. So like I said, the amount of regulation that applies to your HSM depends on 2 criteria: the type of material and manner of recycling. Before we jump into these steps, though, you'll have to take to see which exclusions apply to your HSM. Please ask yourself, what is the material in question, and what exactly is being done with the material? Once you've determined what the material is and what you will be doing with it, you're going to want to start out by looking up the recycling table. It's called Table 1, and it's in Part 261.2C. We'll check out the recycling table together to see if your waste is excluded from the definition of solid waste. If it's excluded from the definition of solid waste, then it's also excluded from the hazardous waste regulations, because if it isn't a solid waste, it can't be a hazardous waste. The recycling table doesn't give out too many handouts, though. Most waste that will be recycled remain a waste until they are completely recycled. After referencing the recycling table and coming to the determination that your waste is still considered a solid waste up until it's recycled, then you can move on to the next step, step 2. Step 2 is determining if your material is excluded from the definition of solid waste under the 4 use, reuse, recycling exclusions. These are listed in 261.2E1 and 261.4A8. If your material is directly used or reused in a process without first being reclaimed, then it may be excluded from the definition of solid waste. If your waste doesn't fit the definitions of use or reuse, then in step 3, you may find that there are waste-specific management standards that are less stringent when you recycle your waste. If your material to be recycled isn't listed in parts 266, 273, or 279, then you'll have to move on to the final step to hopefully find an exclusion. Step 4 asks you to check out 261.4 to find any remaining exclusions you can apply to your situation. Step 4 is the final step, but it is also where you will find the HSM exclusions, which can apply to pretty much any waste stream that is destined to be recycled. But we will talk more about the HSM exclusions later in this presentation. Right now, let's go through the order of operations in a little more detail. Remember, you must know what your material is and what you're going to do with it before moving through these steps. The goal is to determine if your material is excluded from the definition of solid waste, therefore excluded from the hazardous waste regulations. So the first step in your investigation is to look up the recycling table. Certain materials are exempt from the definition of solid waste when destined for recycling. If your material falls under a dash in the table, then it is excluded from the definition of solid waste and is not subject to RCRA hazardous waste regulations. If your material falls under a star, then you're probably going to want to proceed to step 2 because your hazardous secondary material is not excluded from the solid and hazardous waste rules. We are still trying to determine if our recyclable material is a solid waste or if it's excluded from the definition of solid waste. Step 2 asks you about your recycling process. Is your waste directly reused in a process without first being reclaimed? The direct use or reuse of a secondary material without prior reclamation is also a form of recycling. There are 4 use or reuse exclusions from the definition of solid waste. If your waste falls under one of these descriptions, then it is excluded and you may manage it as a material or product. First, is your waste reused as an ingredient to make a product without being reclaimed? This applies even if you're selling your waste to a downstream vendor that is using your waste as a product without reclamation. Essentially, what might be a waste for you or your process would be considered a raw material to someone else or a different process. The next question is, can your waste be used as a substitute for a commercial product without first being reclaimed? For example, hydrochloric acid byproduct from chemical manufacturing can be used by the steel industry for pickling steel. This would be exempt from the definition of solid waste. The third question, is your waste returned to the original process without first being reclaimed? It may be left over from your process, but it can be reused and returned to the original production process from which it was generated. It is not a solid waste. This exclusion only applies if the material is used as a raw material or feedstock in the production process, and if it is not reclaimed prior to its reintroduction into the system. An example of this is emission control dust returned directly to a primary copper smelting furnace. Lastly, if your waste is reclaimed and returned to the original process, and it is only stored in a closed-loop tank system, it may be excluded too. However, there are some stipulations to this one. Reclamation cannot involve controlled flame combustion, such as occurs in boilers, industrial furnaces, or incinerators. The secondary materials can never be accumulated in such tanks for over 12 months without being reclaimed. And the reclaimed material cannot be used to produce a fuel or used to produce products that are used in a manner constituting disposal. Whew. Okay, so maybe your waste stream is not exempt from the definition of solid waste in step 2. We checked the recycling table in step 1 and it fell under a star. We went through the direct reuse exemptions and your waste stream doesn't fit in there either. Don't fret. Just because it is considered a hazardous waste doesn't necessarily mean you have to manage it as a hazardous waste. Some hazardous wastes have specific management standards that are much less stringent than the hazardous waste management standards. These are some of the specific management standards in Part 266. Staying on topic of recycling, though, I want to point out precious metals and lead-acid batteries as two common hazardous waste streams that are often recycled. While hazardous wastes that will be reclaimed for their precious metal content are exempt from much of the Subtitle C hazardous waste regulations, these materials lose any applicable exemptions if they are accumulated speculatively. To document the speculative accumulation is not occurring, generators must keep records showing the volume of materials on hand at the beginning of the calendar year, the amount of materials generated or received during the calendar year, and the amount of waste remaining at the end of the calendar year. You also want to keep documentation showing that you can recover an economically significant amount of precious metals. With lead-acid batteries, they can be regenerated, a form of reclamation. And when they are destined to be regenerated through electrolyte replacement, then they are not subject to the hazardous waste regulations, except for the requirement to document your waste determination. Other specific management standards that are less stringent than the hazardous waste regulations are Part 273 for universal waste and Part 279 for used oil. Remember that these alternative management standards only apply when your waste is destined to be recycled. Step 4. Is your solid waste excluded from the hazardous waste regulations because it falls under Part 261.4? There is a long list of hazardous wastes that are excluded from the hazardous waste regulations, and yours might be one of these. But the exclusions we are going to focus on later are the hazardous secondary materials exclusions seen at the bottom of this list. Specifically, we will look at the HSM transferred for the purpose of reclamation. But first, before we dive deep into the exclusion, I want to walk you through some scenarios where you use the steps I laid out to determine if your waste is excluded. Just by the title of this slide, you probably already know which step this exclusion will be found in. But let's go through the steps to see how this works. In this scenario, an acid rinse is washed over a product and collected in a tank below. The acid wash water is then directly pumped over top and back into the process. The point of generation for the waste stream is in the tank. However, it is pumped back into the original process and directly reused. Let's see if it is excluded from the solid waste or hazardous waste regulations. Let's check the recycling table first. That's our first step. The waste in question is the acid wash water. However, I wouldn't call it spent yet. It's not a sludge, not a byproduct or a commercial chemical product or scrap metal either. so it doesn't really fit on the y-axis. Okay, so what are we doing with the acid wash water? Well, its use is not constituting disposal. It isn't being used for energy recovery. We aren't reclaiming it before reusing it. And I think it's safe to say that we are not speculatively accumulating it because it is being pumped directly back into the process. So what are we doing with the acid wash water? It just doesn't fit on the x-axis either. That's okay. Your material for recycle may not always fit somewhere on the recycling table. Let's go on to the next step. Step 2. Does the process fall under one of the direct reuse descriptions? That's right. The acid wash water is returned to the original process without first being reclaimed. It is excluded from the definition of solid waste under 261.2E1. 3. You do not have to manage the acid wash water as a waste. Not until it is spent. Once it is spent, you will have to make a new waste determination. Next scenario. Spent acetone collects under a parts washer into a container at a satellite accumulation area, or SAA. The facility has a distillation unit nearby. The facility operator has to pour or pump the spent acetone from the SAA drum into the distillation unit for the acetone to be recycled. Where is the point of generation? It's the satellite container below the parts washer. What is the waste at this point? A spent material. What do they plan on doing with the waste? They plan on reclaiming it in a distillation unit. Okay, now that we have that established, let's go to our first step in the order of operations. The acetone is a spent material that will be reclaimed in the distillation unit. Let's check the recycling table. The spent acetone is a spent material and it is being reclaimed or recycled through distillation. If you connect these two on the recycling table, you will see a star. This means that the spent acetone is considered a solid waste before it is recycled, while it is being stored before distillation. If the spent acetone is a solid waste, then it is subject to the hazardous waste determination, which we all know that spent acetone is a hazardous waste for at least the ignitability characteristic. Therefore, before the spent acetone is recycled or reclaimed, it is subject to the hazardous waste management regulations. Oh no. And remember, it is stored in an SAA container before it is brought over to the distillation unit to be reclaimed. If you're storing your waste before recycling it, are you subject to the hazardous waste regulations? Yes. If your material ends up with a star in the recycling table, then it is considered a solid waste that is subject to the hazardous waste regulations up until the recycling process. You will have to label the SAA container as hazardous waste and with the indication of the hazard of the contents, and keep the container closed when not adding or removing the waste. Not until it enters the distillation unit is it excluded. As we move through the steps in our order of operations, we find in step 2 that the spent acetone is not directly reused. In step 3, we don't see spent acetone as a specific waste stream with its own management standards. But in step 4, we notice the HSM exclusion, the generator-controlled exclusion for materials generated and reclaimed at the generating facility. This might be your saving grace, the all-inclusive HSM exclusion. But let's go through another scenario before we touch on the HSM exclusions. In this last scenario, we are looking at a facility that has an electroplating process that generates corrosive wastewater that is treated at their on-site wastewater treatment facility, generating an F019 filter sludge containing aluminum. The filter sludge is stored at the facility before it is shipped off-site to be recycled. The neutralized wastewater is subject to your industrial wastewater pretreatment permit, but the sludge is a listed byproduct. The point of generation is the collection container below the filter press. You don't have an on-site recycling process to reclaim the aluminum, so it is stored at your facility until it is shipped or transferred off-site to be reclaimed elsewhere. The filter cake is considered a sludge, and it is a listed hazardous waste. What will happen to the listed sludge? It is destined to be reclaimed off-site. Oh no, that's right. Again, your waste stream gets a star on the recycling table. It is not exempt from the definition of solid waste, and therefore it's subject to the hazardous waste regulations. So what about storage before reclamation? Well, recyclable materials that have a star in the recycling table are considered a solid waste when destined to be recycled and are subject to the hazardous waste regulations before the recycling process begins. This requirement can be found in Part 261.2C, where it says materials are solid waste if they are recycled or accumulated, sorted, or treated before recycling. Ensure your container is closed and properly labeled. It will also have to be shipped on a uniform hazardous waste manifest. Let's not get down on ourselves just yet. We'll follow the steps to see if our waste can be excluded somewhere else. Well, we know that step 2 doesn't apply because the filter sludge is not directly reused without first being reclaimed. In step 3, we don't see wastewater treatment sludge as a specific waste stream with its own management standards. But in step 4, we notice the HSM exclusion, the hazardous secondary materials transferred for the purpose of reclamation. Oh boy, are you ready? HSM exclusions. Now we finally take a look. The HSM exclusions allow generators to manage hazardous secondary materials without being subject to the RCRA hazardous waste regulations as long as the HSM is destined to be reclaimed. Hazardous secondary material. It is a substance generated from the industrial process, spent material, byproduct, or sludge, that when discarded would be identified as a hazardous waste. When destined to be reclaimed, the HSM is not considered a solid waste nor a hazardous waste. HSM is reclaimed if it is processed to recover a usable or valuable product, or if it is regenerated. Wastes are regenerated when they are processed to remove contaminants in a way that restores them to their usable original condition. Recycling hazardous waste versus HSM exclusions. Like we saw in our scenarios, even if you're planning to recycle your hazardous waste, it might still be subject to the hazardous waste regulations prior to the point in which it is recycled. With the HSM exclusions, essentially any hazardous waste that is destined to be recycled is excluded from the definition of solid waste, and therefore is not subject to hazardous waste management standards during storage prior to recycling, because the HSM is considered a material. What a miracle! Finally, a relief and a real incentive to recycle your hazardous waste. The HSM exclusions really are excellent. New reprieve for generators looking to do the right thing and recycle their hazardous waste. But what is the catch? There has to be some catch, right? Well, kind of. It's not as simple as simply telling your hazardous waste inspector that your hazardous waste is exempt because you're claiming the HSM exclusion. No, there are several requirements that you have to follow, and everything has to be documented. So can you really claim the HSM exclusion? Well, you really do want to go through the order of operations and check to see if your waste stream is excluded somewhere else before you jump straight to the HSM exclusions. This is because you might be able to save yourself some time from completing and retaining a lot of paperwork. In step 4, you will find the main HSM exclusions found in parts 261.4A, 23 through 25. Each of these exclusions has its own requirements that must be met to successfully claim it. The first one is the generator controlled exclusion for materials generated and reclaimed at the generating facility. This exclusion could be reclaimed for the scenario where the facility generated a spent acetone from its parts washer and uses their on-site distillation units for reclamation. The next one is the transfer-based exclusion, which is for materials generated and reclaimed at different facilities. The scenario with the listed aluminum filter cake that the generator has to send off-site to be reclaimed would be a great candidate for this exclusion. Then there is the export exclusion for materials exported for reclamation. If your hazardous secondary material needs to be exported out of the country to be fully reclaimed, then you would have to follow the requirements under 261.4A 25. All three of these HSM exclusions have their own distinct requirements that must be met, or else you cannot claim the exclusion. In this presentation, I will summarize the requirements for the transfer-based exclusion, but the best way to ensure you are in compliance is to read the entire regulation yourself. For all of the HSM exclusions, you are required to notify ADEQ that you are an HSM handler. You will do this through your MyDEQ account. If you don't have an EPA ID number or a MyDEQ account, you are still required to create an account for your facility in order to notify ADEQ that you're claiming the HSM exclusion. In MyDEQ, under your facility account, where you create or modify your EPA ID, select Yes for if you are a hazardous secondary material handler. Next, the HSM handler will have to document that the HSM is not speculatively accumulated before reclamation. The rule for avoiding speculative accumulation is to ensure that at least 75% of the material is recycled by the end of the calendar year. This can be done with a tracking sheet in Excel. Shipping documents. So it's time to send your HSM off to the reclaimer. With this exclusion, your HSM does not need to be manifested on a uniform hazardous waste manifest because it is not considered a hazardous waste. It is a material. Therefore, a non-hazardous waste manifest, a bill of lading, or a receipt will qualify as documentation showing that your HSM was successfully transferred to the recycler. It is important to note that the exclusion also requires confirmation of receipt from each reclaimer. A manifest without the third signature from the destination facility would not qualify. You would have to have the third signature to show it was received. Sometimes recyclers provide certificates of recycling. This or some sort of received signature from the recycling facility would meet the requirement. If your HSM needs to go to multiple facilities to be fully reclaimed, then you will be required to provide records that show that the remaining HSM is received at the final recycling destination. For example, if you're sending your hazardous solar panels to a recycler that breaks down all the parts into separate materials, where the steel or aluminum is going to a smelter, the broken glass goes to a separate recycling facility, and the plastics go to another recycler, you will have to maintain receipts that all downstream recyclers receive your HSM. You may have to speak with your initial destination facility to coordinate how and when you will receive the downstream vendor receipts. Speaking of coordinating with your recycler, there is the due diligence requirement. Your facility needs to be positive that your HSM is legitimately recycled. To claim the transfer-based HSM exclusion, you'll have to document and certify that your facility performed its due diligence and can affirmatively ensure that any intermediate facility and reclaimer involved in the reclamation of your HSM meets the legitimate recycling requirements. Since your HSM still is considered hazardous, there is a requirement that regardless of your hazardous waste generator status, your facility must maintain an emergency preparedness plan or contingency plan. How long do you have to hold on to all of this documentation? 3 years. Same as the hazardous waste retention requirement. And not only do you have to maintain documentation for 3 years, but your facility must make reasonable efforts to ensure legitimate recycling at a minimum frequency of 3 years. That essentially means your facility should conduct an audit of your reclaimer every 3 years. Let's talk a little more about due diligence to ensure your HSM is legitimately recycled. No sham recycling allowed here. No matter which type of recycling, in order to be excluded or subject to reduced requirements, the recycling must be legitimate and not a sham. The generator must show that their HSM will be legitimately recycled by documenting that the HSM will provide a useful contribution, produce a valuable product or intermediate, be managed as a valuable commodity, and the product of the recycling process must be comparable to a similar product. Let's go over each of these factors in more detail. A material provides a useful contribution to the recycling process or a product or intermediate if it contributes valuable ingredients, is a source of a valuable constituent recovered, is recovered or regenerated, or is used as an effective substitute for a commercial product. You can prove that your recycled material is valuable if you sell it to a third party or if it is used as an effective substitute for a commercial product or ingredient. A product can be a valuable intermediate if it is used in the process, even if it has no value on the open market. However, it must have a real use in the process. For example, a substandard cinder block being used to build a building to store more cinder blocks is not a valuable product. Your recycled material must be managed as a valuable commodity. Materials are managed as valuable commodities if there is a similar raw material and the material is managed consistently or in an equally protective manner, or if there is no similar raw material, then the material must be at least contained. For example, if the hazardous secondary material is replacing a material that it resembles, it should be managed in the same way or in a way that is equally likely to prevent a release. A valuable commodity is likely stored in an intact container away from the elements. What does it mean for a product of recycling to be analogous to a legitimate product? It means that the product of recycling should not contain significant levels of hazardous constituents. To prove that your product of recycling is comparable to a similar product, you can compare the levels of hazardous constituents and any hazardous characteristics of the two products. A product made with a hazardous secondary material should not have significant concentrations of hazardous constituents and should not exhibit a hazardous characteristic if the analogous products do not exhibit them. The goal is to ensure that hazardous constituents aren't being discarded into products where they don't belong, or toxics along for the ride. For all recycling exclusions, even direct reuse, because we're talking about everything now, not just the HSM exclusion, the generator is required to document which recycling exclusion it is claiming. Similar to having waste determination documentation for every waste stream generated at your facility, you need to have documentation showing that it is not a waste and why. Every recycling exclusion also requires the generator documents how they know that their excluded waste stream is legitimately recycled. The best way to do this is to write out how the recycling process meets the 4 factors. It is crucial that your facility maintains this documentation for every hazardous secondary material generated at your facility, because one day your facility may be inspected by ADEQ or EPA, and if you're not prepared to demonstrate to us that the conditions for the exclusion are met, then we may find your facility is in violation for improper management of hazardous waste. Luckily, we are here to help you in advance. The EPA has created an HSM checklist that you can use to document how your hazardous secondary material is legitimately recycled. There's also a template for completing your legitimacy documentation. And ADEQ's hazardous waste unit is always open to answering your regulatory compliance questions. This concludes my presentation on hazardous secondary materials and recycling. I'm happy to take some of your questions now, but please refrain from asking any site-specific questions. Our hazardous waste ICU email is the best place to send those questions. Thank you.